the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile, which I mentioned. India has recently sold this platform to the Philippines, which has its own territorial dispute with China. So could we see Beijing applying pressure on Russia for India not to sell the BrahMos to countries with which China maintains difficult relations? The Philippines, other countries that are considering purchasing the platform include Vietnam and Indonesia.
Now, I'd like to move on a little bit to talk about competing Chinese, Russian, and Indian influences in South Asia. South Asia is obviously a huge battleground for great power competition between India and China, but I want to know what role Russia plays in this. I'm thinking perhaps of Sri Lanka, which has competition from all three.
So I think the most pronounced form of Russia's presence in South Asia is really through its strategic partnership with India. Their cooperation through joint military exercises, India's purchase and joint development of military platforms with Russia. Over 50% of India's in-service military platforms remain of Russian origin. So whether it be the BrahMos, which is the supersonic cruise missile, which both countries produced together as part of a joint venture, the S-400 air defense system, which India relied on heavily during its most recent conflict with Pakistan, stealth frigates, fighter aircraft, tanks, assault rifles. India is heavily dependent on Russian military hardware. Although there have been delays in the delivery of some of these platforms due to the war in Ukraine, and I think India's dependence on Russian military hardware has declined over time. So from about 72% or so of its total arms imports about a decade ago to about 36% today. I think the important watch point, and perhaps an area of concern, is that in the context of the deepening China Russia relationship, to what degree will this conflict with or undermine the India Russia relationship? So, for example, if China applies pressure on Russia to restrict the transfer of certain technologies to India, an example of this could be the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile, which I mentioned. India has recently sold this platform to the Philippines, which has its own territorial dispute with China. So, could we see Beijing applying pressure on Russia for India not to sell the BrahMos to countries with which China maintains difficult relations? The Philippines, other countries that are considering purchasing the platform include Vietnam and Indonesia. I think it's also going to be important to see what position Moscow takes on future uh, uh, India Pakistan or India China hostilities. Uh, you know, Historically, Russia's position has been relatively neutral during periods of conflict between India and China. But could that shift? Could that change in the future? On Russia Pakistan, I mean, that's a relationship which is less mature, but we have seen some signs of a shift. Notably, Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif was in China for the SCO summit, and he had a meeting with President Putin on the sidelines of the summit. So I think these are important watch points in looking at how Russia's role and influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region is likely to evolve in the coming months, weeks, and years.
On the Indian Ocean region, what do you think about small island states in the Indian Ocean like the Maldives? Why are India and China fighting over places like the Maldives, and what does the future here look like?
So, with respect to the smaller island states, I mean, China's primary interest is ensuring this freedom of navigation along the Indian Ocean region. So, this is vital for China's security. Over 80% of China's oil imports transit the Indian Ocean region, and almost all of its trade with Africa, Europe, and the Middle East goes through that ocean. And this explains the strategic importance of these small island states to China. Why President Xi Jinping visited Maldives in 2014. He was the first Chinese president to do so. Why China and the Maldives have recently concluded a free trade agreement, which went into effect earlier this year. I think India's interest in the Indian Ocean region and the small states there is as far more long-standing interest, which comes from the fact that it has this geographic proximity. It was involved in a failed peace process in Sri Lanka during its 3 decade civil war. It averted an attempted coup in the Maldives in 1988. And it's also emerged as an important source of economic assistance to several countries. India is often seen as the lender of last resort or even the lender of first resort when these countries are in economic distress. It's extended lines of credit and economic aid to both Sri Lanka and the Maldives when they're in a difficult situation. So I think Just as we've discussed with Nepal, I think that there's a similar tug of war or tug for influence between China and India among the states of the Indian Ocean region.
I think another interesting region to look at in this context is Bangladesh. Obviously, we saw the fall of Sheikh Hasina last year in 2024. Since then, China, Bangladesh, and Pakistan actually hosted a trilateral just before the SCO summit in June. What does the future look like for Bangladesh, a place again with competing Indian and Chinese influences?
So on this question of where Bangladesh fits in the China-India rivalry, I would say Bangladesh has maintained a relatively balanced foreign policy, and my sense is that even with the change of government last year, after Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's removal from power, there's been more continuity than change in the Bangladesh-China relationship, at least when we compare it to Bangladesh's relations with India or Pakistan, where I think there have been more drastic shifts. I think a downturn in relations with India and improving relationship with Pakistan. So I think the Sheikh Hasina government maintained a relatively balanced foreign policy. It arguably leaned more towards India, but it maintained cordial relations with China. And this is evidenced by the fact that more than 70% of Bangladesh's arms imports came from China in the period from 2019 to 2023. And this was before the so called monsoon revolution, the overthrow of the Sheikh Hasina government. I think what has changed now is this. Balanced or so-called balanced foreign policy that Bangladesh pursues is gone from leaning more towards India to leaning more towards China. On your question about this meeting of ministers from China, Bangladesh, and Pakistan in June, I mean, we also saw a meeting last month of the foreign ministers of Afghanistan, China, and Pakistan in Kabul. And I think this reflects, in some ways, Beijing's effort to leverage India's sometimes difficult relations with neighboring countries, and the fact that South Asia is among the least economically integrated regions of the world. And this puts China in an advantageous position essentially to set the norms of regional cooperation or integration, leveraging its position as a leading trade partner, source of foreign investment, and an increasingly important development partner for several countries in the region. And then just finally, I mean, I think it's important again to take a step back and look at the broader point about uh, about their concerns both about China's presence in South Asia, but also about India's presence in East Asia, at least from China's perspective. Although perhaps less prominent, India has been an increasingly prominent actor in China's backyard. We saw this with India conducting its first joint naval exercises with the Philippines in August. Modi's visit to China was preceded by a visit to Japan. And there's even been a war of words of sorts between Beijing and New Delhi on the issue of Taiwan. And I think this sort of reflects the fact that, or both countries' differing perceptions of the regional order. India opposes the emergence of some sort of China-centric regional order in Asia. And we saw this in the readout of the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. The Indian side noted or the idea of a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia. The Chinese side only referred to a multipolar world. It did not mention a multipolar Asia. So I think it again sort of alludes to a broader regional rivalry between China and India in the Indo-Pacific region.
And then on Afghanistan, in Indian local news, there have been reports recently that India may recognize or be coming close to recognizing the Taliban in the coming months. I wanted to ask again a bit about competing Indian and Chinese influences in Afghanistan, as I think this may be a newsworthy topic in the coming months.
I mean, the China factor does play into India's engagement or increasing growing willingness to engage with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. But in some ways, I think it's the Pakistan factor which is even more prominent. And what I mean here is that Afghanistan and Pakistan have had an increasingly difficult relationship. Surprisingly, frankly, following after the Taliban reassumed power in 2021, and I think this reflects the fact that the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Durand Line, has never been fully recognized by the Afghan government. Afghanistan, interestingly, was the only country which voted against Pakistan's admission to the United Nations. Um, And this was based on the fact that it did not recognize the validity of this, what is referred to as the Durand Line, which separates Afghanistan from Pakistan, and plays into the broader issue of Pashtun nationalism. So we've seen border skirmishes between Pakistan and Afghanistan in recent months, which have fueled tensions between both countries. And this is, just as with Bangladesh, we've seen a deteriorating relationship with India, accompanied by an improving relationship with Pakistan. On the flip side, we've seen a deteriorating relationship by Afghanistan with Pakistan, accompanied by an improving relationship with India. So I think that to some extent or to some degree explains that reset or improving relationship between the Taliban regime in Kabul and New Delhi.